thank you all for coming today. This is our final Dean's Seminar that's related to the Sloan for this year, the Sloan grant. And we really thank you all for coming because Wayne and I this summer are going to be working on some of the issues in that roles and responsibilities section of the grant. After talking to all of you, many of you anyway, thinking about these issues, looking at different issues that came up in the interviews we did. And this summer we're going to be putting together some kind of recommendation for how we might move forward. So this is going to be a really helpful seminar today. And again, thank you for coming.
Yeah, because we're especially excited. We've seen the work that they've done elsewhere. We've heard a lot of comments from our colleagues. We've seen them do some of this presentation before. So we're really excited to hear what they had to say on guide and kind of give us a framework of where we're going and kind of get us started in the conversations. So without further ado, introductions.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy week, so we appreciate you taking the time. Was that an understatement, John? Yeah. Especially history advising this semester. Yeah, very tough. But for all of you, so I do appreciate it. I have the honor of doing the introductions of two colleagues of mine, but also some friends. And over the years, I have seen them do some pretty fabulous work and talk about what they're going to talk about today. And I know it's always inspired me, and I'm sure it will do the same for all of you. So, a little bit of bio for you. Jeff Osborne, I think you can figure out which one's Jeff and Beth, right? is the Dean of School of Science and Professor of Biology at the College of New Jersey. He has been there since 2006, spent 15 years prior to that at Truman State. And Frida and Kristen will remember, possibly, Jeff was actually our facilitator at the Kerr workshop that we did several years ago. Let's leave it at that. Do you remember that? Yeah, exactly. At TCNJ, actually. So that's when we first met him. And he helped. He's one who came, with his help, we came back here. And that's where the ACRE program, which really helped open up that program across all of the disciplines and restructuring in a way that really invited a lot more student involvement happened. So we thank you for that those many years ago as well. And Beth was also involved in facilitating that weekend. So. Okay, I digressed. So he was at Truman State for 15 years, where he served as professor and chair of biology, director of the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Talent Expansion Program, and chair of the Undergraduate Research Committee. He also received the award, a fellowship for faculty excellence there. He comes to us with a bachelor's from Texas State, and he majored in biology, and he also finished his master's in botany there, and then earned a PhD in plant biology from Ohio State. He has been a very active researcher, receiving over $6.1 million in funding for his work as an investigator or co-PI. And a lot of the work I've known Jeff to do is really playing, as you can see by the titles they presented here, a leadership role in Council of Undergraduate Research and mentoring countless schools to promote and expand their undergraduate research programs, as well as helping Kerr become a much stronger voice and advocate for undergraduate research nationally. Also with us today is Dr. Beth Paul, who is at Stetson University as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. She arrived there in July 2009, and she also came from the College of New Jersey prior to that. She was there since '92. During her time at Stetson, most recently, she was Vice Provost. She also had an interim appointment in the Student Affairs area, and also served prior to that as a professor in the psychology department and as chair. She also held faculty positions at Wellesley College and was a research associate at Harvard. She has worked also, in addition to her work with undergraduate research, with the Bonner Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with that, it's a program very like our SHRC scholarship. So students who are engaged in service work under the Bonner program and engage in that, and actually served as a model for the Stabler grant that we recently received to do that kind of work. Some of you may remember Beth because she also assessment consulting, or as we like to call it, ice cream consulting around here. And so she was with us, gosh, 2 years ago, I think, to do a series of assessment workshops with you. Some of you may remember her in that role. Thank you, Chris. Yes, time does fly. Beth received her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Boston University, and she received a doctorate in personality psychology in 1989. And as I mentioned, she also was part of the Harvard group that went to the Higher Education Management Institution. So she was my classmate for 2 weeks at Harvard as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Beth and Jeff. Thank you.
Well, it's great to be back with all of you. I actually recognize many faces, and I remember really very fondly the 2 days that I spent with you talking about ice cream. And I have been very excited, actually, to follow along in how much ice cream you've been eating since that time. Actually, it's really been fun to talk with Andrea about the progress that you've been making to support learning at your institution, because that's really what it's all about, and that's really why we're here again today. So we're very pleased to be here with you today. Our goal is to give you lots of things to think about. Our goal is not to be prescriptive in any way, but to give you ideas, to give you a couple of models in progress, to give you, just some possibilities that can inform your thinking as you're defining what will be unique to Albright in terms of definition of faculty role, definition of faculty workload, and the whole system of interconnected pieces that go along with that. So it'll be a lot of fun, I know, for us over the next hour and a half or so. So these are the questions that really do guide our entire time with you. And they're very conceptual. We don't have answers to them. They're questions that we invite you to ponder and to think about in reflection, in connection with your mission. So Albright, I was just reading it actually earlier, right next to the Office of the President, there is your mission. You have a particular mission that drives this institution. So how does that also drive the definition of the faculty role, and therefore the definition of what faculty do? So some questions that might help you to start this thinking. What are the main components of the faculty role? I know this has been part of what you've been talking about in the interviews that have been conducted over the last year. So what are the main pieces of what you do that help to advance the institutional mission? How do the main components of the faculty role relate to your institutional and departmental missions? So how are they purposeful in advancing the institution? And then how do the main components of the faculty role interact or intersect in working towards your institutional or departmental mission? It's always so striking what we do in academia. We take something that is a whole, and then we quickly start to decompose it into component parts. So that's exactly what we, as a field of higher education, have done with the role of faculty. We do the same thing with students, but let's take faculty as an example. And we separate you into legs and arms and head and heart and any other number of components. We separate you into the role that you play as a teacher, the role you play as a scholar or as an active, engaged learner yourself, the role you play as a citizen in your community. There may be other components too, depending on institutional mission. Sometimes institutions have other components that come into play. So what are those components for you? And how do we start knitting those back together into a whole person? What are some of the issues that come up as we think about, we are actually a whole person. So how do those roles intersect for you? How do they intersect importantly for the good of the university community? So with that foundation in mind, here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about faculty roles and workload. Again, some concepts that we'll share with you that have been useful in our own thinking. Some workload strategies that flow from those concepts about faculty roles. And in talking about workload strategies, we're going to give you two examples. One example from the College of New Jersey that we've both experienced at different phases in the process of that major undertaking at the College of New Jersey. And then I'll also share with you some of the ideas that are now in process at Stetson University, where I've been for about 1.5 years, and we're now starting to do some of this work there. So I'll share some of what we're doing. And then we'll conclude by talking about how all of this comes together in terms of recognition and reward in the university and culture. So there, you can imagine this as an interwoven system that has various pieces, and all of them are sort of moving parts. How do they ultimately come together in the faculty role? So, faculty roles and workload. Talking about the faculty role, we think of the faculty role as a dynamic, lifelong learner. As a unifying concept, that's what we are. We are dynamic, in other words, we are constantly in motion. We are lifelong learners. We are people who have a hungry appetite. We are people who are curious and like to explore, and our minds and hearts are active as we do that exploration. So that is the driving concept here of dynamic, lifelong learner. So one of the phrases that we coined during the College of New Jersey transformation was to define the teacher scholar. For TCNJ, that made a lot of sense, and we'll be talking about that as we go through this. But we defined the teacher scholar as the unifying term for a faculty member, as accomplishing, in other words, it's constantly moving, engaged, and accessible. And those were the defining characteristics that were important to that mission, and I think have become very much important to us as individual professionals in our identities as teacher scholars or as faculty, and that's the phrase that has meaning for us. All of these are words that have a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people, that have a lot of different baggage for a lot of different people, that have a lot of different politics and different institutional cultures and different fields and different pieces of higher education. So none of this is prescriptive. These are ideas that you need to play with in concert with your mission and with what is right for Albright's culture. So for us, the intersecting roles that make up higher education, you have a faculty member who is a dynamic learner. You have students who are dynamic learners in training, if you will. So you have students who are learners developing as scholars. The intersection of that is what we know of as high impact learning. So there are all sorts of practices in facilitating learning that we know now from lots and lots of research over the last couple of decades that really do compose high impact learning. And our argument in terms of the meaning of teacher scholar for us is that it really is that intersection between the teacher as learner and the student as learner, the teacher as learner scholar, the student as learner scholar. It's really that intersection that creates the most powerful learning, or the most creative and dynamic learning environment. So one of the things that you will hear repeatedly throughout this presentation is that the achievement of that kind of learning culture means that you have to align a number of different pieces of the higher education system or of your institutional culture. So it's critical to start with the mission of the institution. And then what does that define about the student role and expectations of students? What does that define about how you structure your curriculum and the kinds of things you emphasize in your curriculum? What does the mission define about the role and expectations of faculty in that enterprise? And then how do you structure faculty work along that role and expectation? How do you structure faculty workload, and how do you recognize and reward the critical parts? The curriculum becomes a very, very important nexus in this system. So it is in the curriculum where you are affecting the learning that is talked about in your mission, and it is done by the faculty who are helping to facilitate that kind of learning. So the curriculum becomes a critical nexus. You can't do work on faculty learning, you can't do work on student learning or on faculty role and workload without looking at the curriculum in terms of how it supports that student learning and how it engages the faculty. So the curriculum is the critical nexus. So when we think about faculty engagement in scholarship, oftentimes we think of that as apart from the teaching enterprise. And this is why we have found the integrated teacher-scholar model to be a much more fruitful way of thinking of the faculty role. Likewise, faculty workload has traditionally been centered on the teacher role, and it's been calculated in units. So traditional courses, or in our case, the course unit, all of us are on a course unit in the 3 institutions that we're talking about today. Those courses are typically defined as classroom-based learning experiences and often don't include some of the most promising and high-impact pedagogies for engaged learning. So what we've come to in many institutions of higher education, this is true of you, this is true of the College of New Jersey, this is true of Stetson, what we've come to is a disconnect. We have ideals and expectations for student learning, knowing that engaged learning is some of the most powerful learning that students can do. We have role definitions and expectations for faculty that involve being a lifelong learner, being dynamic and engaged in one's field of inquiry, and in helping to provide those kinds of high-impact learning experiences for students. But the frustrating thing is, it's happening outside of what we've defined as a workload. It's happening outside of what we've defined as the curriculum. So those all go hand in hand. And part of redefining workload is making sure you're doing that in concert with the curriculum through which you work. So those are interconnected. One of the things that Jeff and I have talked a lot about in these presentations as we move around has to do with integrating those high-impact learning practices into the curriculum and therefore into student work and into faculty work. And this is where the phrase "from the peripheries to the center" comes from. And likewise, it's from language talking about this stuff to actually building it into the culture of the institution. So we have advocated that this work needs to include all of these different components. Again, another way of making the argument that all of these things are knitted together. One can't happen without the other. So one of the things that means, and I know that you are very active in some of these high-impact pedagogies, it means challenging ourselves to think about ways that undergraduate research and other engaged learning experiences. So I know that this is an institution that celebrates community engaged learning or service learning, or I don't know what language you use here, but it very much celebrates that, as well as some other kinds of learning experiences. How do we move them from being optional or non-credit bearing, perhaps for the student, perhaps also for the faculty, or I should say that other way around. We're better now at giving credit to students for these kinds of things, but we're pretty bad at giving credit for faculty for doing these kinds of things. So how can we bring those inside the curriculum, and therefore how can we bring them into faculty workload? What has happened in higher education in having those be separate is it's been very frustrating. It has been very disrespectful, frankly, to a faculty that I think oftentimes knows of the highest impact learning in which they're engaging their students. And yet we don't respect that. We don't respect the work that you're doing in the dominant methods of respecting that work, which is through assignment of workload or recognition in the formal curriculum. So it has been a strong disincentive for faculty members to engage in that kind of facilitation of learning at the very time when we should really be doing something to increase it. It also sends a pretty loud symbolic message about the devaluation of engaged learning for faculty as well as learning for students. It's a disconnect between the faculty's teacher and scholar roles, or even the faculty's teacher and citizen roles. And one of the things that we have advocated a lot for through the Council on Undergraduate Research is that oftentimes these high-impact practices are ways that you can integrate those different pieces of who you are as faculty. So undergraduate research, for example, is one of the ways that that can be intersected, but also so is community engaged learning and some of the other high-impact practices as well. So we do need to talk about curriculum innovation. We do need to talk about how to appropriately value these kinds of engaged learning experiences as the mainstream faculty work, not necessarily as an extra or something that is optional. So part of what we're going to do with you today is to give you some ideas, some of which have worked well and some of which haven't, but to give you some possibilities for how to do that so that you can begin imagining that for Albright. So let me pause there to see if there are any questions about the basic conceptual structure that we're working with today. and then we'll move forward with some ideas about workload. Questions so far? Yes, sir.
How are typically the reactions of other people when they say that typically, traditionally, teaching, research and scholarship and service have been the foundation of what any college, not just research universities, small colleges are about? What are the reactions to this approach when research is different in the natural sciences and the social sciences than from the humanities, which I think is the biggest problem in this approach, don't you think?
No, because I think the foundation of just about any field, I think I'd have to think really hard to see if there's any field that wouldn't fall into this. I think the foundation really is learning. I think the foundation truly is exploration, discovery, curiosity. You know, those are the foundations of any field of knowing or practice. And so that's how we act to help to advance our fields, is through scholarly engagement. And by the way, I'm using that term in a very broad way. We are all in very different fields. Some of us engage in research, some of us engage in creative practice, some of us engage in other forms of practice. But to me, that all comes together in this notion of scholarship. So in my opinion, I do think that the Boyer model that talks about different forms of scholarship is very valuable. It is the foundation of what the College of New Jersey has done. It is the foundation of what Stenson University has done. But I don't, so yes, there are differences in terms of the way your scholarship would look. But to me, foundationally, it really comes down to for me personally, it comes down to me as an active, engaged learner.